Chugwater's history really reaches back to the ranching era. In particular, it reaches back to the great Swan Land and Cattle Company, put together by Alex Swan with Scottish money, or close to $3 million, capitalized in that company. And this soon became, in 1884, it became the headquarters for the Swan Land and Cattle Company. As it added property, the Swan becomes a history in itself, and it extends itself and grows. And the result is that that's really kind of the genesis of Chugwater. And if you talk about Wyoming as being a child of the Union Pacific, I think you'd say, in a sense, that Chugwater is a child of the Swan Land and Cattle Company. It was surveyed in about 1886, and then in 1887, it became then officially a community of Chugwater. And the importance there were two things: the railroad from Cheyenne, it's called the Cheyenne Northern at the time, then also with the headquarters of the Swan Company being located here in this particular area, the railroad and the Swan Company decided that they would plat a town. And so the town then was laid out, recognized as a community. Lots were sold. Now, later on, when a town does begin to form with businesses and buildings, they replat the town. But this time it was platted on the west side of the railroad. And then it begins really to take off. I think that a lot of small towns across Wyoming are close to ranching and farming growth. Chugwater is almost kind of on an equal basis because pretty much everything then to the west of Chugwater is ranching, particularly along Chugwater, or Chug Creek as we call it. All the way up along, you have a whole series of wonderful old-time historic ranches that are there. Particularly what you need the streams to provide the meadowlands and for water. And they also find that the grasses are nutritious and cattle can sustain to it. And the winters, while they can be severe, you can also have mild winters. And thus beginning by the 1870s, there's an early beginning of cattle ranching flourishing. On the other hand, when you go east out of Chugwater, it predominantly is farming. And it's dry land. It begins then in those early years after 1908. They brought what farming equipment they had, and they got off at Chugwater, and there was a fellow by the name of Porter who would show them where they could file a homestead. But if you looked out here on the flats, the Iowa Center Flats, Chugwater Flats, in the teens and in the 20s, there were farms all over. And in the boom years for the town are in those years up into the 1920s, and it's large numbers of people are coming in mainly to homestead. There is a town, but there's also a community of Chugwater. And so if you reach out in a radius of about 25 miles from Chugwater, you have early beginnings of small settlements. And all around Chugwater, you have a community. In 1910, you probably only had about 50 people in the community. By 1920, the census is 318 people. Since that time, there's never been as many people in Chugwater as there was in the 1920 census. And probably by about 1920, you have probably close to maybe 15 or 20 businesses. And then it follows the years into the Depression, dry years of the 30s, and then into the World War II. Then a kind of a revival, a renewal of the town occurs in the 1950s. The World War II veterans are returning. There's a kind of a new lease on life. I was growing up, for example, in Chugwater in the 1950s. And my gosh, we had 2 grocery stores. We had 5 filling stations because Highway 87 was the only highway, and that was Main Street. And so you had filling stations, you had cafes, Chugwater Bank, which has always existed back to about 1912, a couple implement dealerships, and people could still shop and get pretty much what they needed or wanted in Chugwater. And so all these outlying communities established had trade with Chugwater. It's a pretty impressive small town that's operating, and of course there's a lot of travel coming through. It soon changes, however, because with the coming of Interstate 25 north from Cheyenne, things begin to change. And then we move into a period in which there's a certain amount of anxiety. Land is being consolidated. People have been moving off the flats. And so life begins to change through those years up into the 21st century. One of the other things, in 1969, the school burns down. So what does a community do? Do we rebuild a school, or do we bus our students into Wheatland? And that brings a lot of hard feelings. What is once a community that is pretty well within itself suddenly finds itself in conflict. That's resolved, and finally they decide to build. Most people today, if you mention you're from Chugwater, oh, that's where Chugwater chili comes from. Well, Chugwater chili is comes about because a man in Cheyenne is pretty successful with his chili, going to chili cook-offs, and decided at some point that he needed a more catchy name. And so he started, without any consultation with the town council, as I understand it, or he started then using the name Chugwater chili. Well, he was still successful, and so in about 1985 or 86, 5 families go together and buy the rights to the recipe and the name. A year after these 5 families had purchased the recipe, what really is seasoning, it's not the chili soup itself, but it's a seasoning. They started the Chugwater Chili Cook-Off, and it is the state championship, which brings in anywhere from maybe 1,000 to 1,500 people in this small town. It's a full day of celebration, bands, and all kinds of things going on, and games, and people can taste the chili and vote for who they think has the best chili. Despite the fact that Chugwater does not have a U.S. senator or a governor, people of that sort of fame, it does claim Steamboat, the horse. A lot of people think that Steamboat was the horse that was drawn for the license plate, but nobody is sure that occurred. But Steamboat did become a famous bucking horse. And Chugwater's claim to fame, if you will, it was the place, the beginning of Steamboat. So, one of the things you say, well, what's in a name of Chugwater? And that's interesting in itself, because it is an attractive name. It catches people. In fact, when I went off to college, students would ask me, where are you from, Hudson? And I'd say, well, Chugwater, and I knew what was coming next. Well, how did it get its name? And I would relate the story, and then they would say, Hudson, you're putting us on. The story probably comes through from various early trappers talking to Indians, and presumably a Mandan chief who was disabled and could not lead the buffalo hunt for that year, whenever. And he convinced his son, who the anglicized name would have been the Dreamer, to take over leadership of hunting buffalo. And the son evidently dilly-dallied around, and he was presumably a dreamer, too lazy to do it, whatever, but evidently come up with the idea, let's go out and surround the buffalo, and let's then decoy them, get them to go over the cliffs. Now, Chugwater is located in a valley with a stream running through it, and hence the Indians then, hearing the chugging of the buffalo as they hit below these cliffs, they would hit and made it, in their language, made a chugging sound. And so they named the stream the water where the buffalo chug. They passed that story, I presume, to the mountain men, and in terms of people like Jim Bridger or others, it became then, that was the naming of the streams. And a town takes its name from Chugwater. In a small community, you get to know everybody. Even in your school, you have one school that houses all students from K through 12. You know all of those students. You know every teacher. And so you have that closeness, that togetherness that small towns afford. I think another thing that even still draws me to Chugwater today is its beauty. You know, we could go up in the bluffs and hike and wade in the creek. In 5 minutes you're outside of town, you're out in the country, really close to nature. It was a great place to grow up, and I have really a deep affection for Chugwater, and I think most of us who grew up in Chugwater really are appreciative of the fact that we did grow up here.
Encampment got its name when the fur trappers came here in the early 1800s. They started trapping all across the West. They held a little camp here. They called it Camp LeGrand in 1838. It was shortly after the bigger rendezvous that year that was held up on the Poposia. And they called it Camp LeGrand. That kind of evolved into the Grand Encampment. And they called this area the Grand Encampment for many years. When the town came about decades later, they named it Grand Encampment and is actually incorporated as Grand Encampment and is still Grand Encampment in spite of the fact that the U.S. Postal Service says we have to only be Encampment. The Grand Encampment area developed because of a way for people to get from point A to point B. When the Arapahoes went through here, they traveled from up in northern Wyoming and central Wyoming down into Estes Park, Colorado area a lot. And so transportation has always been important here with the trails. The earliest people who were in the encampment area who were not Native American were the fur trappers and the explorers. So we have direct connections to some of the iconic names of the West. We know Kit Carson was here. He brought John C. Fremont through here in 1844. We know that Jim Baker was here. He has really direct ties on the west side over on the little Snake River Valley, but he was here. Jim Bridger was here. All of those early mountain men were here. The actual earliest community right in this area within, a mile and a half or so of here, it was the town of Swan, which was downstream from Doggett or Riverside, and it was started by the Swan family originally, and the Swan family is really known, the name, in the state of Wyoming because of the large Swan Land and Cattle Company. The Swan brothers who came here, there were 4 of them who came here. They were related to Alexander B. Swan, who had the Swan Land and Cattle Company, and they had a post office there, and they called it Swan. In the 1879-1880 period, the first homesteaders came in here and claimed land, and they started raising cattle and crops. Some later raised some sheep. Crops being mainly hay, some wheat, but that was dryland wheat and not a lot of that. So agriculture has always been the mainstay of this valley. It's still the predominant industry in our area today. But during the 1897 to 1908 period, we were known for our copper district. It was the copper district of the era. People who came here came from Cripple Creek, Colorado, and the mining opportunities there were starting to dwindle, and miners always go to the next big strike, and they came here. One of the most unique features of the Grand Encampment Copper District was the way that they actually transported the ore. Initially, they hauled it by wagons. That was very hard. The Ferris Haggerty mine was on the west side of the Continental Divide, 16 miles from Encampment, and the smelter that was established right near the Encampment River. So they came up with the idea to build an aerial tramway. It was 16 miles long, crossed the Continental Divide, had 270 ore buckets. It was a massive undertaking. It was built in 1902, 1903 in the wintertime, in an area where the snow is extremely deep. The key to mining was to get the ore to markets. There's no market here. So they hauled it in freight wagons. They hauled it in summer and winter. They hauled it in an aerial tramway. All the time, all they really wanted was a railroad. The railway came to Encampment after the boom had already died. They had fires at the smelter, and they didn't rebuild because the price of copper had dropped. So we got our railway too late to benefit the mines at all. So the railway benefited the ranchers, who then used it for shipping their cattle and their sheep out of here for many years until 1974. Everyone thinks of Grand Encampment as the Copper District era, but really at the same time we had tie hacks here. We had as many tie hacks working in the mountains as we did miners. They were originally cut ties for the Union Pacific. Later they cut ties that were used in our own Saratoga Encampment Railway and the railway that came from Walcott down to Saratoga, plus to support the Union Pacific. They would cut these ties in the mountains They would deck them up in the wintertime. In the spring, when the snow melt started running and the streams were high, they'd kick the ties into the streams and float them down to Fort Steele, where they put them on the railroad. In 1902, we had about 3,000 people living here. That's sort of hard to imagine. It's so quiet in Encampment now, but back then, it was a very busy place. There were miners in the hills, there were tie hacks in the hills, there were ranchers out doing their work, there were businessmen, we had electricity, we had running water, we had all of the amenities. Charles E. Winter was a newspaper editor here with the Grand Encampment Herald during the mining boom era. He left here for a while, and he went back to Pennsylvania on a visit, and he became very homesick for Wyoming. And while he was in the Lehigh Valley of Pennsylvania, he wrote the words that became the Wyoming state song. And then he came home, and the music for the song was also written by a local man here in Encampment. So we proudly claim that we are the birthplace of the Wyoming state song.
Wyoming, Wyoming, land of the sunlight clear.
Laura Webb Nichols' family came in here in the 1879 period. They were among the earliest homesteaders, the Nichols family. As a young girl, she was 12 or 14 years old. She got a camera for her birthday and she started taking photographs. She took photographs the rest of her life, and she documented the history of the people and the activities of our community in a way that no one else has ever done nor ever will do, because it was over like 70 years of documentation, about 20,000 negatives. She gives us a wonderful, wonderful glimpse into what our community story is. The Grand Encampment Museum is 50 years old this year, and we're very proud of that. It was started by two local women who one day said, we got to start collecting some of this stuff, and this is what they collected. It's quite an operation that we have now. We have moved in 17 different structures from a variety of places. We have one cabin, the oldest cabin out of Saratoga. We have the Slash Ridge Fire Tower. We have an original homestead house that was the Perriam family, one of the early homestead families here, and businesses that were from various locations. We have at the museum in the 1970s, we moved in 3 original tram towers that came from up on the line. The original moved in by the Lions Club, and then we redid it. It is an icon for the community. Everyone knows that's Encampment if you see a picture. The other iconic structure that we have here is our 2-story outhouse. And we built that as a replica in 1976 for the bicentennial of America. And the reason you have a 2-story outhouse is sounds kind of crazy, but the snow got so deep in the winter up in the mountains that you couldn't get to the bottom floor. So you would get to the top floor easier. And so the seat on the bottom floor of the outhouse tips up. So in the wintertime, you use the top floor, and allegedly everything just goes with gravity down. So our tramway and our 2-story outhouse are two really iconic features. Not many museums have a fire lookout tower though, so we're quite proud of the Slash Ridge Tower that came off of the Snowy Range, and it's the best view of the town of Encampment today is to climb the tower. From our boom days, Encampment dwindled quickly down to 400 or 500 people, and it's held steady at about 400 or 500 people ever since probably 1910. The mainstay economy is agriculture. We have a lot of people who live here who work elsewhere. They commute because it's a beautiful community. Our greatest feature is our mountains right to the west. We have a lot of public land. We have 4 wilderness areas that are right nearby. So people come here to enjoy the outdoors and to recreate. We don't have any stoplights. We barely have one paved street, but we have friendly people, and we have a lot of events that go on annually that really give people a variety of things to do. The future of Encampment is probably much like the past. This is a community that's going to endure. We don't have a lot of businesses, but we have some good businesses. We have a good school, and we have our ranching community that's not going to go away. So we're probably not going to change a lot. You won't find a lot of big fancy nightlife or anything like that, but you will find a place where you can reconnect with nature.
I was born and raised here at Thermopolis. I'm fourth generation native, so my roots go deep. You got to understand how Thermopolis came about. There was no access into the Bighorn Basin except from the north and coming in from the east. We're bounded by mountains and natural topography all around us. It was difficult to get in here. The reservation had all of this country that was south of Owl Creek, but there was a little notch right at the mouth of Owl Creek where it joins the Bighorn River that Ben Hansen took out a claim for a town site there. He had a little settlement started there, and so they had this shooting over there, and a Dr. Schulke, he was the only resident doctor in the area, came over from Lander to treat the gunshot wound. He had been here before, and it was attracted to the hot springs. And so the folks at the mouth of Owl Creek decided they wanted to have a post office there in their settlement, so they didn't have a name for their town. And that's when Dr. Schulke and a couple of old Irishmen by the name of McGill and O'Reilly, they got together, and a couple of the neighbors around, and they decided they'd name it Thermopolis because they would name it after the hot springs, thermo for hot or boiling, and polis for city. The post office actually moved down to the Old Town, we call it Old Town now, in 1895. The deal was around the Big Springs was all reservation. There wasn't any settlement allowed here. So I think there were probably politics involved, but anyway, they bought 10 miles square from the Indians because the game had been depleted, one thing and another, and they got it for 90-some cents an acre. It automatically opened it up for white man settlement here, and in 1896, there was a town at the mouth of Owl Creek. By 97, everything had moved here, and they just abandoned that town out there. They more or less picked up the old buildings and just came this way, and where the deal was that the state of Wyoming would own a 1 mile square around the Big Springs, and that would be set apart as the state reserve, and the rest of that 10 mile square would be opened up to white man settlement. One of the stipulations that when the land was bought from the Indians was Chief Washington said that the water had to be free to use. So to this very day, we have the state bathhouse, which is free to use, and it's water comes straight from the hot springs to that. And the Indians used it way before the white man was here. The Crow and the Shoshone and the Sioux, and Blackfeet came into this area, and so it was used by several different tribes. When the white man got opportunity to use it, well, then they naturally commercialized it, and so anything outside the free water was concessionaires came in with the plunges and the hotels and things that we have today. This area was established for agriculture purposes, ranching and farming mostly, and that has diversified a lot through the years, but when they discovered oil here, it changed the country. And when the train came here in 1910, it opened up trade and ways to get your product in and out of here. Probably our biggest boom years were in the 50s and the 60s. We had Empire Oil, had a refinery here in town and employed a lot of people. And there was mining operations still going on in the 50s and a little into the 60s. And the oil fields were booming pretty good in those years. So I think we probably peaked around, I would say, 5,000 or 6,000 people probably in the county at that time. Tourism is a pretty big business. It's year-round because that hot water, the plunges and the hotels are open. They cater to folks year-round. The state park has just gone through a 20-year plan looking ahead. There'll be some changes in the state park. A lot of the old things will stay. The things that really draw the people is the terraces that people like to walk, and the swinging bridge, and of course Monument Hill. It's not many places you see a hill with a sign on it. We're not really isolated, but we're not in the thick of things. We have one stoplight, and that's plenty. I don't know, you can go a lot of places in the country, but you know, there's certain places that just strike you as a good place to live.